Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to be in Ezekiel again, but today we're going to study chapter 35, verse 1 through chapter 36, verse 15. Now, I've told you at least twice in the last couple of weeks that we were, the last time being chapter 34 last week, that we are basically through with the judgment part of Ezekiel, with only maybe just a little bit remaining, and now we're going into promises of restoration. Last week we had a great study about the reunification of Israel, the promise of reunification of Israel and Judah under one shepherd, David. Now, here we are in chapter 35 and 36 and a half, the first half of chapter 36, talking about the judgment of Edom and the nations. So, based on my statements to you recently, that we're basically through with the judgment part of Ezekiel, I'm puzzled about how does this show up here all of a sudden. So I'm puzzled by it, and I asked myself a couple of questions. One is this section about judgment of Edom and the nations out of place? You know, last week we had this perfectly wonderful study, not my teaching necessarily, but the scripture about the promise of reunification of Israel and under one shepherd, David. It's all promise into the future. So it's exactly consistent with what I told you. But now we've got the judgment of Edom and the nations. So the question is, one of the questions I ask myself, is this section out of place in the Bible? Should it have been somewhere else? Where we could just, like, if we really feel like it's out of place, can we just cut it and paste it somewhere else where we think it ought to be? Or could there be a reason for it being right here where it is? I vote for two. I believe this is where it belongs. It's where it should be. And we're going to look into that, see if we can come up with a good answer for it. What we're going to see, if it belongs right here where it is, what we're going to see is that the judgment of Edom and the nations in 35 verses 1 through 15 it's the basis for the salvation of the mountains of Judah or Israel. We're going to see in chapter 36 that the prophecy is addressed to the mountains of Israel, but it's really using that to be synonymous with the land, physical land mass of Israel. We're going to see that there are four promises of restoration in the first half of chapter 36, and all of the last half of chapter 36 is about restoration. So I think that this is exactly where it belongs. We're going to see that we're talking about the judgment of Edom, which we've already had one. We're going to talk about that in a minute too. The judgment of Edom and the nations being going to form the basis for the restoration, the promise of restoration and salvation for Israel. We're going to see that as we go. So let's get right on into it. Let's start with chapter 35, verse 1. The overview of chapter 35 is symbolic of Edom, where it's referred to as Mount Seir, S-E-I-R. The judgment of Edom in chapter 35 was the basis for salvation of the mountains of Israel in chapter 36, verses 1 through 5, which we're going to see later today. Just by way of background, in 1950 BC, Esau conquers the Horites at Seir and sets up an administrative presence in Edom. We're not going to go back and search all that stuff out in the scripture. I'm just going to give you that as a given. 1950, Esau conquered the Horites, and he sets up a contingent, I guess an office, an administrative presence in Edom. Edom, you know, is just east of or southeast of Israel over the mountain range. In 1925 BC, Esau moves to Edom or Seir with his family, and this is when and where the nation of Edom was founded. You know, we've always said that and taught that Edom is the nation formed from the descendants of Esau. Well, this is where it started, 1925 BC, when he moved there. Then, in 605 BC, Edom, with Babylon as an ally to Babylon, invades Judah. Then moving on down the line, in 587 BC, Edom is with an ally to Babylon, and they burn Solomon's temple. I guess that's, they get into town there and just burn the temple. Then in 500 BC, Edom goes extinct. If you recall, we saw that in chapter 25. We had a whole study on the book of Obadiah, which is basically mostly related to a prophecy of Edom. And we found out that it was prophesied to go extinct, just disappear from the face of the planet, almost from records. And we found out, I showed you where it did in the book, in the teaching on Obadiah. I gave you some background for that. So Edom unlocks the key to dating the book of Obadiah to 586 BC. And that's when Babylon marched on Jerusalem. Obadiah is only one chapter long, is devoted almost completely to the judgment of Edom. It may have a little bit there of the judgment of the nations. So let's go to Obadiah and read some of the stuff. Now, Obadiah is not a book that you normally spend much time looking up, so you may not know where it is or may have trouble finding it. It's only one chapter long. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. It's kind of fast. Maybe you have trouble finding Amos too. I don't know. But let's go to Obadiah. And I want to read. You can just follow as I read. I want to read verses 10 through 14 with maybe some comments as I go. 10 through 14. Now remember, I told you Obadiah is a book of prophecy about Edom. Because of the violence against your brother Jacob. Now remember, we talked about Esau being the founder of the Edomites. The descendants of the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. Esau's brother was Jacob, you recall. Because of the violence, and remember they were prophesied to always be fighting with each other. In the womb they were fighting, and it was prophesied they would always be that way. So because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. On the day you stand aloof while strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. Remember I told you when we were looking at the background, Edom was a big time ally of Babylon, and they hated Israel and Judah, the descendants of Jacob, so bad that they cheered and jeered and egged them on. They egged on Babylon and Assyria in the northern, when they were fighting the northern kingdom, to just get after them and whip them. They just were just that way. And he says here in verse 11 of Obadiah, on the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth, it's the wealth of Judah, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. He was an ally, but he was almost like he was one of them. You should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster, nor gloat over them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. So you see, this is a prophecy about Edom, and it was talking about how they were just cheering and jeering Babylon as they went on about defeating Jerusalem. And in verse 14 it says, you should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives or hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble. They hated the descendants of Jacob so bad that, Babylon had surrounded Jerusalem, and people in trying to get away would sneak out at night to try to get away. This verse 14 says that they were waiting at the crossroads. They were waiting out there to catch any one of those guys sneaking out of Jerusalem so they could turn them over to Babylon as prisoners. Okay, and then in if we look at verse 15 to 18, we see their judgment in Obadiah, verse 15 to 18. The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. So it's going to be eye for an eye kind of thing. What you do, Edom, I'm going to do right back to you. That's what God says. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and be as if they had never been. In 17, but on Mount Zion will be deliverance. It will be holy, and Jacob will possess his inheritance. So regardless of how bad you hate him, Edom, Jacob's going to win out. He's going to possess his inheritance, which is the land of Israel. Then 18, Jacob will be a fire and Joseph a flame. Esau will be stubble, and they will set him on fire and destroy him. So metaphorically speaking, Jacob and his brother Jacob will be fire and Joseph a flame. They're going to, as it says here, they're going to burn up Esau as stable. He's going to be defeated, and he's going to disappear from our thoughts and minds. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. So in chapter 35, we will see an eye for an eye judgment, because what you did to Israel, I will do the same to you, is what God is saying. As we study through chapter 35, we will see the judgment and the reason for the judgment in chapter 35. The declaration of judgment we see in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 35. So let's get right into it. It's pretty clear. Let me read it. Chapter 35, verses 1 through 4. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Mount Seir. That is the metaphor for Edom. Set your face against Mount Seir. Prophesy against it and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm against you, Mount Seir. I'm against you, Edom. And I will stretch out my hand against you and make you a desolate waste. I will turn your towns into ruins, and you will be desolate. Then you will know that I am the Lord. It's pretty clear. They are one of the malicious neighbors that we talked about. We talked about Israel being surrounded by malicious neighbors. The country, the nations that surrounded them were malicious. They had malicious thoughts and reasons against Israel. They hated them so badly. So, well, I kind of talked about what malicious means, but what does it mean? What it means is you wish for the worst to happen. If you have malice, harbor malice in your heart against somebody, you wish for the worst to happen. Like you talk about murder with malice, is what it used to say, first-degree murder. It's a planning, wanting it to work out a certain way to the detriment of your victim, so to speak. That's what they did, and as Babylon defeated Judah and Assyria defeated Israel, they jeered and cheered. They had such malice and hatred. So God promised that Edom would one day be desolate. We saw this in Obadiah. Let me read verse 12 of Obadiah. Verse 12 of Obadiah. What I just said was one day they would be desolate. We saw that in Obadiah verse 12. Verse 12 says this: "You should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast in the day of their trouble." I think I just gave you the wrong scripture reference. Verse 10. "Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever." That's what I mentioned before. It's also mentioned in Isaiah 34 verses 5 through 17 and Jeremiah 49 verses 7 through 22. They were vengeful, malicious, and constantly took sides against Israel. And this has gone on for hundreds of years. God promises one day they would be desolate. All right, verses 5, back to chapter 35 of Ezekiel, verses 5 through 15 are the reasons for the judgment. Verse 5 says this: "Because you harbored an ancient hostility and delivered the Israelites over to the sword at the time of their calamity, the time of their punishment reached its climax. The time of its punishment reached its climax." They had hostility, and they delivered the Israelites over to the sword. They encouraged the enemies, and did everything they could to bring about their defeat. They helped as allies to those that were against Israel. Obadiah 10, "Because of the violence against Judah, they had desired to possess Israel's land because they felt it should be theirs anyway, because of Jacob's deception in his conniving ways of getting the birthright from the firstborn Esau." So that's where it goes all the way back to there, and the prophecy of when they were in the womb that it would be that way. And in verse 6 says, "Therefore, as surely as I live," that is an oath by God. He doesn't need to give an oath. He gives it here as emphasis to the truth. "Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I will give you over to bloodshed, and it will pursue you. Since you did not hate bloodshed, bloodshed will pursue you." So God says they should be victims of bloodshed because they had perpetuated bloodshed and violence against Israel. They wanted Israel to shed blood. In verses 7, 8, and 9 say this: "I will make Mount Seir a desolate waste and cut off from it all who come and go. I will fill your mountains with the slain. Those killed by the sword will fall on your hills and in your valleys, and in all your ravines. Then verse 9, I will make you desolate forever. There it is again. We saw it in Obadiah. Now we see it here in chapter 35, verse 9 of Ezekiel. I will make you desolate forever. And that literally means forever. You know, we talked about some of these nations. Well, let's take Israel, for example. They go into captivity for 70 years. Prophecy by Jeremiah was a 70-year sentence, and their land was desolate, but it was a temporary thing. And then under the Medes and the Persians, they were released to go back. They're still under the thumb of the Medes and the Persians, then under the thumb of the Greeks, and then under the thumb of the Romans. But they were released. It was not their desolation of their land was not a permanent thing. It was a 70-year thing. So Edom was to be destroyed. The land would be filled with the slain, and the land would remain desolate. All right, verses 10 and 11. Let me read those two verses. Because you have said, these two nations and countries will be ours, and we will take possession of them, even though the Lord was there. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I will treat you in accordance. There's that oath that God issues. Again, he doesn't have to give an oath so that we'll, as a promise that he's going to do it. If he says it, he's going to do it. He doesn't have to give an oath. He gives an oath for emphasis on the truth. He says he's going to do it, and I'm giving an oath just to emphasize so you will know I'm putting emphasis on what I'm saying. He says, therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I will treat you in accordance with the anger and jealousy that you showed in your hatred of them, and I will make myself known among them when I judge you. So, it's a list of things that they said, and God will hold them responsible for. In verse 10, he said, we want their land. It's all about the land. They felt the land should be theirs. It was Abraham gave it to Israel, gave it to Abraham, and it passed down through Abraham to Jacob. They thought it should be theirs because of the birthright thing, deception that we went to. Then verse 12 says this, then you will know that I'm the Lord. No, then you will know that I, the Lord, have heard all the contemptible things you have said against the mountains of Israel. You said they have been laid waste and have been given over to us to devour. Okay, we can devour, take over their land, which is blasphemous because God gave it to Israel, and they disregard that. They don't like it the way things came out. They think that it goes back to the deception of the birthright. No, it goes to the promise to Jacob to have the land. All right? So then we get to verse 13. Verse 13 of chapter 35 says this. You boasted against me and spoke against me without restraint, and I heard it. They boasted against God incessantly. Theirs has to do with Israel being God's chosen. And look at them now, not protected by God, and they've lost everything. They're taunting, they're boasting. They are, is there a better word? Well, the word boasting is used here. They're saying, yeah, God's their protector. Look at them. Look where they are. This illustration, this illustrates a spirit of defiance and jealousy, which Malachi spoke about in Malachi chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. We won't read about it, but it's talking about a spirit of defiance and jealousy regarding regarding Esau. And then we come to verse 14. Well, let me just run over there and read it, see if we can get something out of it. Malachi, verses 1 through 5. I may not have any comment on it. Let me just read it. A prophecy, the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord, but you ask, how have you loved us? But you ask, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? Yet I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated, and I have turned his hill country into a wasteland, and left his inheritance to the desert jackals. Edom may say, though we have been crushed, we will rebuild. There we go. This is what it's all about. Though we have been crushed, we will rebuild the ruins. But this is what the Lord says. They may build it, but I will demolish it. They will be called the wicked land, a people always under the wrath of the Lord. In verse 5, you will see it with your own eyes and say, great is the Lord, even beyond the borders of Israel. So they have this spirit of defiance and jealousy. Defiance towards the Lord and jealousy towards Israel. You may say that you're going to tear us down, God. We'll just rebuild, without even giving him any credit for being the sovereign Lord. They can do whatever he wants to do. And he said that they're going to be desolate forever. And that's what they are. Desolate forever. Okay, so we get to verse 14, chapter 35. It says this, this is what the sovereign Lord says, while the whole earth rejoices, I will make you desolate. As Edom rejoiced over the calamity of Israel, the whole world rejoiced over their destruction. And then verse 15 says this, because you rejoiced when the inheritance of Israel became desolate. Now, what is the inheritance of Israel? The land, the physical dirt and rocks and trees of the promised land. That is their inheritance. 15, when you rejoiced when the inheritance of Israel became desolate, this is how I will treat you. It became desolate for 70 years. When they went into Babylon, captivity into Babylon, Jeremiah said 70 years. They were gone 70 years. And then King Darius sent them back, or Artaxerxes, same guy, sent them back to rebuild. You can read that in the first couple of chapters of Nehemiah. But you rejoice when the land went desolate. It was only desolate for a short time, but they didn't know it was going to be that way. Because you rejoice when the inheritance of Israel became desolate, this is how I will treat you. You will be desolate. Mount Seir, you and all of Edom, then they will know that I am the Lord. Okay, notice Edom rejoiced when Israel's inheritance became desolate. What is Israel's inheritance? It's the land. Today, I think you'll find this interesting. What is it that the entire world, it seems like the entire world, except for the United States, what is it that the entire world does not want Israel to have? The land. They keep making deals. They want Israel to make deals with all these various groups to avert war. We want you to give them part of your land. They always want the peace treaties are always based on Israel giving up part of their land. Okay, in verse 10 to 13, it's all about the land. Edom wanted the land for themselves. God promised the land to Abraham, and he expects and promises that they will have it. We'll see more as we come to chapter 36, verses 1 through 15, which is where we are now. Okay, so now let's go to chapter 36. Now, the first 15 verses, we're going to go through the first 15 verses today. They have to do with one of three accusations against Edom and the nations. And then in the verses 8 through 15, we have four promises of restoration. So if you recall, when I got started, we talked about judgment of Edom, and then it's going to flow into the judgment. The reasons for the judgment are going to form the basis for the salvation. It's going to form the basis for the restoration in Ezekiel. All right, so let's look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 36. Son of man, you don't have to understand that yet. Maybe you'll understand it when we get to it, but we're going to flow from judgment into promises of restoration. All right. 36 verses 1 and 2. Son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel and say, are the mountains of Israel, just when you hear that term, think of it as the land. Prophesy to the mountains of Israel, prophesy to the land and say, mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. The enemy said to you, aha! The ancient heights have become our possession. Edom and the nations are the enemy. You can look at verse 5 and see that there's a reference there to the nations and to Edom, and they're called here the enemy. The enemy said, your land is now ours. When Babylon captured them and deported them or exiled them from the land, Edom says, aha, they're gone now. We can start claiming some of that land for ourselves. And the aha is a word of sarcasm and scorn. More hatred. They've gone, they've been defeated by Babylon, they're conquered, they're deported from their land, exiled from their land, and Edom wants to be sarcastic about it. They're filled with malice for the brothers' people, Esau's brothers' people, Jacob. Our verses 3 through 6 is a long introduction for the statement God makes in verse 7. He gives his reasons for judgment, that the sovereign Lord swears an oath. And we've already mentioned that's not an oath that's required for you to believe that he's going to do it. It's an oath that's sworn for emphasis to the truth of the matter that he says he is going to do it. Just for emphasis. It's not a guarantee that he's going to do it. It's a guarantee he's going to do it because he said it. We need to understand that. When God issues an oath, it's not to guarantee what he said. He doesn't have to give any oath about anything. We know he's the God of truth, and whenever he says it, he's going to do it. It's added for emphasis. All right. So let me read verses 3 through 6, chapter 36. Therefore, prophesy and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Because they ravaged and crushed you from every side, so that you became the possession of the rest of the nations and the object of people's malicious talk and slander. Therefore, mountains of Israel. Remember, he's talking, his prophecy is addressed to the mountains of Israel. It's not to the people, it's to the mountains of Israel. It means the people, but it's to the land where the mountains of Israel is the metaphor. So therefore, mountains of Israel, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to the mountains and hills, to the ravines and valleys, lest there be any doubt, to the desolate ruins and the deserted towns that have been plundered and ridiculed by the rest of the nations around you. Verse 5, This is what the sovereign Lord says. In my burning zeal, I have spoken against the rest of the nations and against all Edom. For with glee and with malice in their hearts, they made my land their own possession, so they might plunder its pasture land. There it is, with glee and with malice in their hearts. They hate Israel and Judah, all the descendants of Jacob. They plundered the land while it was desolate, because they ravaged, because they crushed you, because they ravaged you, because they crushed you, because they showed malice toward you, because they slandered you, because they plundered you and your land, because they ridiculed you. They showed glee and malice toward you. They made the land their own possession. They also showed jealousy, hatred, hostility, bloodshed, and anger. You can see that over back in verse 35, chapter 35. Because you suffered the scorn of the nations. God says this in verse 7. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I swear with the uplifted hand that the nations around you will also suffer scorn. Because Israel was held in contempt, they were hated. They were hated with wrath and malice in the hearts of Edom and the nations, because of all those things that we just read about here, in the scorn and contempt that they were held in by Edom and the nations. God says, I swear with uplifted hand that the nations around you will also suffer scorn. He says, they dished it out. They're not going to be able to take it when I dish it out. He said, I'm going to dish it out directly to them. Okay. Let's look at verses 8 through 12. Here we have 4 promises to Israel. He is talking to the mountains of Israel, the land which the nations took when it lay desolate. There was nobody there to protect it. They just took it. Listen as I read verses 8 through 12. But you, mountains of Israel, will produce branches. I want you to read this. We're talking about restoration here. Many people think this is Eden-like conditions. Just listen as I read it. Verse 8 through 12. Because you, mountains of Israel, will produce branches and fruit from my people, Israel, for they will soon come home. Boy, that's got a nice ring to it if you're in captivity. I'm concerned for you, and I will look on you with favor. You will be plowed and sown, and I will because the land will be plowed and sown with seed, and I will cause many people to live on you, the land. Yes, all of Israel, the whole house of Israel. The towns will be, when they say all of Israel, they mean the whole house of Israel. That means northern kingdom and southern kingdom. The towns will be inhabited and the ruins rebuilt. I will increase. Now, that rebuild is an interesting word to me. Edom was told in prophecy, you're going to be destroyed forever. And what they do, they have that spirit of defiance. I think the word that I used was when God said, he said, we'll just rebuild it. You tear it down, we'll just rebuild it, God. God said, I don't think so. Judah, on the other hand, was sent into captivity for 70 years, not forever. A finite period of time, 70 years. When they get out, they get to go back and they will rebuild. It says here, the towns will be inhabited and the ruins rebuilt. In verse 11, I will increase the number of people and animals living on you. And living on you, think of it, this is addressed to the land. The people and animals are going to live on the land, live on you. the people and animals living on you, and they will be fruitful and become numerous. I will settle people on you as in the past and will make you prosper more than before. Now that is interesting. I'm going to stop right here for just a second. I can't say for certain about Judah, but I know that the northern kingdom was, before the Assyrians conquered them, was going through a period of unparalleled prosperity. I suspect that Judah, the southern kingdom, was the same way. It says here, you will prosper more than before. Wow. Then you will know that I am the Lord. In verse 12, verse 12, I will cause people, my people Israel, to live on you. They will possess you, and you will be their inheritance. You will never again deprive them of their children. They will possess you. He's talking to you, the land. He says they will possess you. They will possess the land. You will never again deprive them of their children. You will be their inheritance. You, the land, will be their inheritance. Okay. So verse 8 says the people would soon return home. In the prophet's vision, you know what he's thinking. If God says soon, that means whenever we get out of this place, we get to go back and we're going to be free, and all this stuff is going to happen soon. Well, it hasn't happened yet, but it will happen. We know it will happen. It's going to happen in the millennium, on the second coming of Christ, of Jesus Christ. Many people think that this is a description of Eden-like conditions. It's easy to say that because we know that later in Ezekiel, we do talk about Eden-like conditions that will be happening in the millennium after the second coming of Christ. And we know over in the New Testament, it's going to be talking the same way in Revelation. So it's just a natural thing to think that this is describing Eden-like conditions. You know, when Adam and Eve sinned, they lost reconciliation with God. What's going to happen at the second coming of Christ? The whole world is going to become reconciled again, and all that was lost because of that original sin is just going to be wiped out, and we're going to return to Eden-like conditions. And we're going to see that when we get later into Ezekiel. I forget the chapter, but we're real close. Real close because we're real close to the end. Okay, verse 9 says, God looks on his land given to Israel with favor. In verse 10 it says, the whole house of Israel. I think I mentioned that as I read it. The whole house of Israel will, more and more people will come home to walk upon you, it says, the land. They will rebuild, and I mentioned rebuilding. I talked about how with scorn and with defiance, Edom just told God, what did he tear it down? We're just going to rebuild it. It ain't going to happen for them. It is going to happen with the promise right here. They will be able to rebuild. Verse 11 talks about prosperity more than before. I've already mentioned that about the northern and the southern kingdom going through unparalleled prosperity at the time they were defeated by their enemy. And this says it's going to be more than before. In verse 12, they will possess the land, their inheritance, again. They will never again lose the land. Their birth rates will never decline. You know, one of the things that went through, I believe it was the northern kingdom, and I'm sure the southern kingdom as well, their birth rates declined because of their constant times of war. Men were killed. the land was desolate, food supplies were short, and their birth rates were just low. There were probably the mortality of babies was very high because of all the negativity that was going on with their enemies and with the food supplies and water supplies and that sort of things. That's not going to happen again. Okay, so let's keep going to verse 13. Let me read verse 13. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because some say to you, land. He's talking to the land. It's hard to think about, but that is what this is directed to. Let me go back. Verse 1 says, Son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel. Say to the mountains of Israel these things. Say to the land these things. Again, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, when the people of Israel were living in their own land. Verse 13. This is what the sovereign Lord says, because some say to you, the land, you devour people and deprive your nation of its children. Because people say to you, the land. When the spies, they were getting ready to go into the promised land, they came back and said that the land was full of giants, but they also said the land will devour the living. I don't have a scripture reference for that, but that's what they said. The land will devour the living. He says here, let's see. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong verse. You devour it because some say to you, the land, you devour people and deprive your nation of its children. Nobody's going to say that again. Verse 14 says this, verse 14. Therefore you will no longer devour people and make your children childless, declares the Lord. The land will no longer devour you. You will possess it forever. It will never again be taken from you. The land was promised to them by God. When they get it back, they will never lose it again. They don't have it back yet. They have a small piece of it right now. And it's getting smaller all the time because the United Nations is constantly wanting them to give up land to appease those foreign entities and their enemies around them, to settle the wars that are going on all the time, it seems like. They're constantly having to give up their land. That's never going to happen again once they get it all back. Okay, then verse 15 says this, No longer will I make you hear the taunts of the nations, and no longer will you suffer the scorn of peoples or cause your nation to fall, declares the sovereign Lord. No longer, listen to this, no longer will I make you hear the taunts of the nations. Taunts. When a country is conquered, or when some people are taken as, maybe not conquered, but some people are taken as prisoners of war and they're put in a prison camp, they're constantly taunted by their captors. I want to read something. I hope I can remember. I think it's Psalm 127. I'm so glad I found it. What he said was, you'll never be taunted again. Let me look at 15 again. 15, verse 15 of chapter 36 is, No longer will I make you hear the taunts of the nations. No longer will you suffer the scorn of the people or cause your nation to fall, declares the Lord. Listen to Psalm 137. As a result of teaching, I can't remember if it was Hosea. Yeah, but it was Hosea. I taught this when we got to a good stopping point in the middle there, or maybe it was at the end. I taught Psalm 137 of what it means to be in captivity. So there's a video out there on Psalm 137. Listen to the way this goes. It's about some captives from Jerusalem being captive to Babylon and being taunted. Listen to this. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of those songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. They're sitting there, they're being taunted, and their captives insist on them singing songs of joy. Now, if you're in captivity, there are not going to be many days you're going to be filled with joy and happiness. And they're sitting there, since their harps were hung in the tree, they didn't want to play them. And yet they were forced to. They were taunted. Verse 15 of chapter 36 says, you will never be taunted again. They're sitting there in captivity being taunted. And verse 15 says, you will never be taunted again. See if there's any other comment I'd like to make about verse 15. Let me just read my comments. The final promise, which needs no explanation, is this. This is what it would be like, what they would be looking for if they were living in captivity. This promise right here. He says, no longer will you have to listen to taunts. No longer will you have to suffer scorn. No longer will you have to be concerned about your country being a danger of falling to the nations. Edom never missed an opportunity to give grief to Israel. For centuries, Edom is just to the east of Israel. There's a big mountain range there, and they would hide up in those mountain ranges and ride out and attack the Israelites. And then they could run back to those craggy mountains thinking they were impenetrable and invincible. So they just felt like God being their overseer was just kind of a joke. So they taunted them, and they had this spirit of defiance continually. And he said, you're not going to have to put up with any more taunts. Edom is out of the way. We'll be out of the way forever. In 600, whatever I said that was, they went away for good, 500 BC. God says not only never again, but Edom will be annihilated. All right, these verses are nothing short of complete fulfillment of the blessings promised to Abraham. It hasn't been fulfilled yet, but we get the promise again. The ultimate fulfillment still lies in the future, when the Eden-like fruitfulness of the earth will be restored in the new heaven and the new earth. That's even further than Ezekiel. We're looking at the Ezekiel version of this is going to be later in chapter 43 or something like that. It's recapped again in Revelation. Return to Eden-like conditions where God's presence is in the midst of the people forever. He will be in the midst of the people forever. All right. Thank you for studying with me. That's all I have for you today.